All right, this is the last section of chapter 2 in our biology unit for Science 30. This is 2.4, and this will take us a couple parts to get through, but we'll work on the first part right now. So this is all on mutations. It says mutations are like typos in a word processing document, a change in the base sequence of DNA that can be passed on to offspring. So a mutation would, most are just small changes in our DNA, and they may occur naturally, so spontaneously, or they may be induced by environmental factors such as X-rays, UV rays, chemicals, and stuff like that. Mutations provide variations in a population that may lead to natural selection. This means that this may drive the evolutionary process. So for me, I always give this example: if you randomly had a mutation that gave you webbed feet. So that means you had sort of like skin in between your toes, sort of like a frog. And that was a mutation that like no one else had and everyone thought you were weird. But one day the earth floods and all of a sudden you become the best swimmer because you've got these webbed feet. Well, the people who don't have webbed feet, they may not survive to have babies, but you will, and you'll pass that gene on. So eventually the population, if that's a trait that's going to help you survive, then the population will start looking like that mutation. And mutations are a good thing because they cause evolutionary change, but it could mean also that it's something that is not good for the environment, and then it probably won't be passed on because you will die off, basically. Some mutations occur in portions of the DNA that don't code for proteins, so these are not harmful. These mutations might not even show up. So we could have mutations in our body that we don't know are even there just because they're not coding for any specific proteins. Our cells may also correct minor mutations, so mutations that happen when they're creating the DNA or replicating. Your body might fix those mistakes before they sort of get magnified. And when I mean magnified, imagine if in your very first cell you have a mutation and then it uses that as a copy and copies millions and millions of copies of it. So that would be a huge mutation, where a mutation in our like body cells, like if you have a mutation in your cell today, well, that is going to, hopefully your body will figure that out and replace it. Some mutations may be harmful. They cause a gene to stop working or to work differently. So mutations could be harmful, and in the case that they are harmful, that would possibly lead to diseases or death, depending on what it is. So the types of mutations that exist in our DNA are point mutations is one of them, and this is known as a substitution. So one nitrogen base is substituted for another during DNA replication. So we've got the original strand here, and when they go to replicate it, they do something slightly different. So I'm gonna just separate these into 3. So that one's good, this one's already not good, and this one's good. So our mutation that's happening right here is where our original DNA had a T, they put an A there. So this might not cause any trouble, but it could cause a lot of trouble. And if we go back to the table that we have for our protein synthesis, so if I will go back to that. That's in the last PowerPoint. If I go back to that table, it was I don't even remember what it was. If it was ATT and AAT, let's see if those are different. So AAT is this, and ATT is this. So if that was the case, then just that change of one letter, that A to a T, that is causing a huge difference because it's coding for a different protein. So when it codes for a different protein, then we are possibly going to see a large difference in what's expressed, I guess is what we should say. Having trouble. There we go. So only one triplet is affected, and this changes the structure and possibly the functioning of the protein. So this could be silent, which I think we're going to get to. So this is just a substitution. So subbing an A in for a T. Okay? So that is our difference there. So that's point mutation. So at one point, there's a mutation. Our next mutation is called frameshift mutation, and this is the deletion of a nitrogen base. So we're going along, we've got CGT, and then ATC. Well, we can see right here that they lost the A. It's deleted. So now the next three to be coded would be TCG. And TCG is going to be a whole lot different than ATC. And that's going to actually mess up the whole rest of it because now we're just one off. So originally we were going to have GAC, now we've got AC something. So not only is it going to mess up like the next codon, but it can mess up the whole rest of the chain of the protein. So all of the triplets following that deletion will be altered. So this could be like a major mutation. Frameshift, okay? So huge mutation, huge results. Probably you're going to see a huge difference in what is created. The third one here is addition. So this is when we insert a new, nucleotide or nitrogen base into the original DNA strand. So again, we're going along CGT, and then we've got ATC, and then we've got AAT. So instead of doing this ATC, which would be the next one, they've put in this piece right here. So that's an insertion, that's an addition type of mutation, and then all of the triplets that are following that addition will be affected. So again, this would be, like I said on the last one, like a major mutation. We're not just messing up one codon, we're messing up the rest of them. And when we think about proteins can be like hundreds to thousands of proteins long. So if this was done near the first of the protein, we could have like 1,000 proteins after that are not replicated correctly. So huge mutations can happen depending on what those proteins are coding for. Some facts about mutations. It says if a mutation occurs in only a few somatic, which are body cells, the cell will likely die and have little effect on the organism. So, like I said that before, in our body cells, our skin cells, for instance, if we have a mutation, our body's probably going to find it and just kill that cell because we have extras. We don't need to keep every single cell that we have in our body, every cell in our body, no, but specifically every skin cell or our body cells, we have lots of extras, so it'll just kill those off and create new, better ones. If the mutation occurs in our gametes, so in our egg and sperm, it can be passed on to our offspring, and this can result in a genetic disease. So if that mutation happens and the egg and sperm carry that on to your very first cell, the very first cell that you are, that mutation is going to be copied millions and billions of times, like I said, and that could lead to what we call as a genetic disease. An example of a genetic disease is cystic fibrosis. the mutated gene ends up in every cell in the body of the offspring. So every single cell in the body, they will see having cystic fibrosis or carrying that gene, that protein that codes for it. And I think I mentioned before, but there's lots of research into coding sort of our genome and figuring out which proteins are created for what. So each protein, and we don't know what every protein codes for, but we do know what some of them do. So people could be screened to know if they have the gene for cystic fibrosis, for instance. So as far as passing on our mutations, well, when a mutation is capable of being passed between generations, it results in an illness, this is known as a genetic disease, okay? So mutations, they're not always an illness, they're not always bad, but in the case that they are passed from one generation to the next and lead to some sort of illness, that's known as a genetic disease. We talked about this before, but someone who possesses a copy of the mutated gene but does not show any symptoms of it is known as a carrier. So we talked about that when we were talking about color blindness. I'm going to give you the example just to refresh you. Remember, I showed you that if that little dot, that red dot meant you're colorblind. Well, this woman, because she has that good X, she would not be colorblind, but she would be known as a carrier. So she carries that gene, but it doesn't show up in her. This guy, on the other hand, he has I'm going to call it genetic disorder because it is connected to genetics. It's not a disease, just a disorder. I wouldn't necessarily say that color blindness is an illness, but he does show up as having the disorder. Okay. So some patterns of genetic inheritance. We've got autosomal dominant. This is when a gene is a dominant gene, and you only need one copy of the gene to get the disease. Autosomal means that it's not found on the sex chromosomes. So remember when I told you before we have 23 pairs of chromosomes? I don't know if I should be writing this here, but anyway, we got 23 pairs, and only the 23rd pair, the very last one, determines if you're XY or XX, okay? The rest of them, regardless if you're male or female, are all little X's. So there's 23 pairs of those all connected together. So there's 22 of them, 22 pairs. So think of that as 44 chromosomes that could have a autosomal genetic disorder. They give you one example here as being Huntington's disease. I don't know if they explain that per se. They don't. Let me just double check what. Sorry. Huntington's disease. Okay, so Huntington's disease is an autosomal, so remember that's not connected to your sex chromosomes. Huntington. And Huntington's disease is a brain disorder, so it provides uncontrolled movements, emotional problems, and loss of thinking ability. So adult onset of Huntington's disease, the most common form of this disorder usually appears in people in their 30s or 40s. So this is bad in a sense because if you have Huntington's disease, then you've probably already had kids. So, but if it's not showing up until you're in your 30s or 40s, you've already had kids and you've already passed on the gene before you realize that you have that disorder. So that's something that's pretty bad about something that is an autosomal dominant, just because that onset. And I think that's why it would still exist in the population most likely because of people not knowing they have the disease and still having children. The next one is autosomal recessive. So this is again in your body cells, not in those 23rd pair, but all of the other pairs. Within those, there's a gene that's recessive, and it's known to cause cystic fibrosis. So remember, recessive means that in order to be affected, you would have to have 2 copies. So I'll make this yellow. So this person would be like have disease. Where someone who has one of them would just be a carrier. Okay. Now, sex-linked recessive, these are diseases that are recessive in the sense that they are sex-linked. So they're linked to the last pair, the XX or the XY. And remember that males are normally the ones that get these sex-linked. Just because they only have one X, they don't have nothing else to override. They don't have a dominant X, okay? So one of the examples, a female would need 2 copies of the gene where a male would only need 1. An example of this is hemophilia. So if I put it as a little H, or an H there, then that hemophilia gene, this man would show up. And hemophilia is a terrible disease. You lack the protein to create platelets in your blood. So platelets are what clots your blood when you get a cut or have some sort of bleeding. And this is, people with hemophilia don't have that, so they could easily bleed out if they were to have like small injuries. So some factors that increase mutations, well, a mutagen is any environmental influence that increases the chance of a mutation. You might be able to think of some things that might cause mutations. Whenever I think of mutations, I always think of some Simpsons episode where they're dumping like nuclear waste into the water, and there's fish that have 3 eyes. I always think of that when I think of mutations. So some sort of mutagen could be mostly, when we think of this, we think of chemicals. So chemicals in the environment that are going to cause our body or our DNA to mutate. And then a carcinogen is a mutagen that causes our cells to divide uncontrollably and is known to cause cancer. So carcinogen, something that causes cancer. So that's it for that section. I'd like you to do 38 to 40 on that, and that'll end that little part about mutation.